On December 19, 1997, a scheduled passenger flight, SilkAir Flight 185, callsign MI-185, operated by SilkAir, a Singapore-based regional airline subsidiary of Singapore Airlines, departed from Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta International Airport in Indonesia, bound for Singapore's Changi Airport. On board were 97 passengers and 7 crew members, totaling 104 people. The aircraft was a nearly new Boeing 737-300. Registration 9 volts DRF, Wikipedia +2 National Library Board +2. After takeoff, the flight climbed to its cruising altitude of approximately 35,000 feet and proceeded uneventfully for some time. Then, at about 16:10 local time, Indonesia time, the Jakarta Air Traffic Control instructed MI-185, which was a beam plunging, to maintain FL 350, 35,000 feet. And contact Singapore Control when passing a reporting point. Party. The crew acknowledged. National Library Board +1. Shortly thereafter, radar data indicate that the aircraft, which had been level at FL 350, began a precipitous descent. At 16:12 and 9 seconds, the aircraft was still at 35,000 feet. 32 seconds later, it had plunged to about 19,500 feet. Within approximately 1 minute of the dive starting, the aircraft crashed into the Musi River near Palembang, Sumatra. At contact, there were no survivors. National Library Board +1. The impact was violent beyond endurance. The aircraft broke up in flight under the enormous forces generated by the dive and breakup. Much of the wreckage was embedded in the riverbed, the fuselage heavily fragmented, and body parts likewise widely dispersed. Only a handful of human identifications were possible. Wikipedia +1. One of the very unusual features of this accident was the suddenness of the descent and the absence of emergency communication or apparent mechanical distress. The aircraft was in good weather conditions, on a normal route, and had not declared any abnormal situation. There was no Mayday or warning. The investigators retrieved both the flight data recorder, FDR, and the cockpit voice recorder, CVR. But even those devices held anomalies. The CVR stopped recording about 6 minutes before impact, and the FDR ceased recording about 1 minute before the dive. Wikipedia +1. From the wreckage recovery and data analysis, the team estimated that the plane entered an extremely steep, virtually vertical dive and reached speeds approaching or exceeding the speed of sound before disintegration. At such speeds and with the structure breaking up, the forces acting on the airframe led to the tail section and other parts separating. Wikipedia +1. Given the lack of a clear distress signal in the abrupt dive, investigators focused on 3 major possible scenarios. 1. Catastrophic mechanical failure, for example of the rudder or tail control system. 2. Some form of structural failure or aerodynamic upset. 3. Deliberate pilot action, suicidal or otherwise. Each of these had supporting evidence and each had significant problems in proving it definitively. Starting with mechanical failure, one candidate fault was the rudder control system's power control unit, PCU. For earlier Boeing 737 models, and similar events, there had been past crashes where the rudder had apparently moved unexpectedly, a rudder hard over, due to internal defects in the PCU dual servo valve unit manufactured by Parker Hannifin Corporation. For example, this type of failure had been linked to the crashes of United Airlines Flight 585, 1991, and U.S. Air Flight 427, 1994. Timnote.info +1. In this case, the investigators retrieved the PCU from the wreckage. The manufacturer's preliminary report was that the PCU was not defective. The Indonesian investigating authority, the National Transportation Safety Committee, NTSC, concluded that they found no evidence of a rudder hard over or PCU failure that could explain the descent. Wikipedia +1. On the other hand, in independent litigation, civil court, a laboratory using scanning electron microscope analysis found burrs and chip outs in the PCU servo valve that could plausibly have caused malfunction, and a jury in Los Angeles in 2004 awarded compensation against Parker Hannifin on that basis. Timnote.info +1. So while mechanical failure is plausible and would match some patterns, The official investigators did not conclude that this was the probable cause, citing lack of direct evidence. Next, structural or aerodynamic failure. The investigators looked at other possible failures: a horizontal stabilizer jack screw mechanism, trim systems, elevator controls, or flight control surfaces. They tested 20 different simulations of failure modes and found that the only scenario that matched the high-speed, steep dive flight path from radar was one consistent with full nose-down stabilizer input combined with active control, something that would not easily happen from a simple failure or from a single control surface fault. In particular, the jack screw for the horizontal stabilizer was found in a position consistent with the full nose-down setting, that is, the stabilizer was trimmed nose-down. Wikipedia +1. But again, the structural failure scenario did not yield a clear single failure path. There was no recorded failure event in the FDR or CVR to show a stabilizer runaway, nor was the jack screw found to be obviously mechanically fractured or jammed. And the general behavior, an extremely rapid dive with no attempts at recovery, did not square easily with known aerodynamic upsets. In many such cases, crews attempt some recovery or there is a period of loss of control. Here the evidence pointed to a steep dive initiated deliberately or under active control, rather than inadvertent loss of control. Simple flying. The third scenario is deliberate pilot action, that is, suicide or intentional act by one of the cockpit crew. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, took part in the investigation because Boeing is a U.S. manufacturer. In December 2000, the NTSB sent a letter to the Indonesian NTSC stating that the evidence suggests the crash was caused by intentional pilot action. Specifically, the NTSB said that the CVR had been intentionally disabled, as implied by the absence of 400 Hz tone that would have been present if the circuit breaker had tripped, and that the FDR had ceased before the dive, which appeared inconsistent with the simple system failure. They further argued that the flight path could not have been produced without deliberate input. ABC News +1. In contrast, the Indonesian NTSC, in its final public report issued in December 2000, concluded that it was unable to establish a cause. It said that the investigation revealed no concrete evidence to either support or rule out mechanical failure, pilot incapacitation or intentional act. They concluded, the NTSC has to conclude that the technical investigation has yielded no evidence to explain the cause of the accident. Wikipedia +1. Thus, two official investigating bodies arrived at different positions, the NTSB leaning toward pilot intentional act, the NTSC declaring undetermined. This divergence has become central to why the event remains controversial and widely discussed. Simple flying. Turning now to the background of the flight crew and circumstances, the captain was Tsu Wei-ming, and the first officer was Duncan Ward. Tsu was experienced, logged thousands of hours, 7,173 flight hours, including 3,614 hours on the 737, while Ward had about 2,501 hours, with 2,311 on the 737. Wikipedia +1. Investigators found that Captain Tsu had experienced some prior disciplinary and training issues. For example, in March 1997, a flight under his command, Mi-274, went into S-turns during descent to Manado instead of a go-around, and later he pulled the CVR circuit breaker in another event. On November 20, 1997, another incident saw the aircraft return overweight due to thrust issues and failing to log the incident. National Library Board +1. In addition, investigation revealed that Captain Tsu had significant personal financial difficulties, trading securities since 1990, non-settlement of trading debt, and had purchased life insurance policies benefiting his family in the event of his death. His net worth had decreased between 1994 and 1996 and recovered only marginally in 1997. At the time of the accident, his monthly income for him and his family was calculated at being less than his expenditures. Reddit +1. This background fed into the hypothesis that the dive might have been intentional or perhaps a suicide by the captain. In support of that, The NTSB highlighted that only a deliberate act could explain the extreme dive profile and cessation of recordings, but the NTSC rebutted that the disciplinary issues were minor and not sufficient to prove a motive, and that the financial problems did not necessarily indicate suicidal intent. They concluded that there was no evidence of motive and that the judgment concerning disabling of recorders or deliberate inputs could not be conclusively proven. National Library Board +1. From a forensic viewpoint, the data available is as follows. The radar trace shows a descent from cruise altitude to impact in less than a minute. The CVR stopped about 6 minutes before the crash, FDR about 1 minute before. The jack screw evidence suggests nose down trim. The wreckage distribution and structural breakup point to an extremely high-speed dive, with likely structural failure as the airframe exceeded its design limits. Investigators ran multiple simulations of hypothetical mechanical failures and determined that none matched the descent as closely as a manual input scenario. In the words of the official NTSC report, the only scenario that matched the radar trajectory was a high-speed steep dive commanded by one of the pilots. Wikipedia +1. Yet despite this, the NTSC still reported that they did not have evidence showing exactly how the dive started, who was responsible, or whether the recorders were disabled intentionally. They pointed to the loss of recorded data as a hindrance and the fragmentation of the wreckage as limiting the physical evidence. National Library Board. The U.S. NTSB, however, asserted more strongly that the captain likely deliberately caused the crash. They cited the disabled recorders, the improbable descent, and ruled out mechanical failure given the absence of a clear fault in the PCU or other systems. The NTSB letter concluded the accident can be explained by intentional pilot action. ABC News. Beyond the investigation, the aftermath includes litigation and compensation. The bereaved families were split in their beliefs about the cause. Some accepted pilot suicide as the cause, others insisted on mechanical failure as the cause. A number of lawsuits were launched. In the U.S., families sued Boeing and Parker-Hannifin, arguing the PCU had failed and caused the crash. In 2004, a Los Angeles jury found for the families and awarded U.S. $43.6 million, based on a defective servo valve theory. Parker-Hannifin eventually settled with other families, but did not admit liability. Timnote.info +1. At the same time, in Singapore, a separate suit brought against SilkAir for willful misconduct, that is, intentional act by the crew, was dismissed by the High Court. The judge found that the plaintiffs had not discharged the burden of proof that the flight was intentionally crashed and that the disciplinary and financial problems of the captain were insufficient evidence of suicidal intent. The judge also accepted that the radar descent profile used by the NTSB could have uncertainties because the aircraft had exceeded normal envelope, thus making modeling less reliable. Therefore, the lawsuit failed and on appeal the decision was affirmed. Reddit +1. In terms of memorials and airline action, SilkAir retired the flight number MI-185 for its Jakarta Singapore route. National Library Board. What then are the competing theories and why does the case remain unresolved? Theory A. Pilot intentional act, suicide or deliberate act. Evidence in favor. The steep dive profile, the jack screw trim nose down evidence, the stoppage of both recorders, not at exactly same moment, suggesting intentional disabling, absence of any hearing of crew call or distress, and the lack of mechanical fault identified by official investigators. The NTSB strongly favored this conclusion. Evidence against. No smoking gun proof of motive. The NTSC concluded that motive was not established. Also, the CVR and FDR stoppage could potentially be explained by power issues but not adequately proven crew personal background, while showing issues may not equate to suicidal intent, and the judgment that a pilot would disable recorders, take the controls and perform a steep dive within seconds, without leaving any trace of attempted recovery, is dramatic and controversial. Theory B. Mechanical, control system failure, rudder PCU or stabilizer system, evidence in favor. Known history of Boeing 737 rudder control issues and PCU dual servo valve defects. Independent lab report found burrs in the PCU. Jury verdict in LA found defective PCU. If a rudder hard over occurred or stabilizer runway occurred, it could give very rapid onset of dive. Evidence against. Official investigation by NTSC found no direct fault. The flight profile, particularly nose-down trim, aligns more with command input than uncontrolled rudder movement. The CVR, FDR stoppage remains unexplained by this scenario alone, and the jack screw position suggests active control of stabilizer rather than runaway. Theory C. Other structural, aerodynamic failure. While examined, this theory carries less support. Simulations suggested it did not match the observed descent profile unless active input was present. There were no major weather or turbulence factors. The aircraft was relatively new, properly maintained, and had logged only 2,200 flight hours and 1,300 cycles since delivery 10 months previously. Wikipedia. Thus, the official Indonesian conclusion was undetermined cause. The US NTSB's conclusion was most likely deliberate pilot action, and civil litigation suggested defective rudder control component. Because of those conflicting conclusions, the crash of SilkAir Flight 185 remains a subject of aviation investigative fascination and controversy, cited often in discussions of pilot suicide, aircraft control system design, cockpit voice, flight recorders, and airline accident litigation. What are the key lessons and implications? First, the event underscores the difficulty of conclusively determining cause when recorders stop and wreckage is heavily fragmented. The loss of CVR and FDR data in the final minutes greatly hampers clarity. Investigators in this case had to rely on indirect evidence, jack screw position, radar traces, wreckage distribution. The fact that both recorders ceased at different times complicates the story. Some experts believe that the different stoppages point toward deliberate intervention rather than a common system fault. Others believe that the recorder's stoppage could be due to electrical power interruption or damage before crash impact, leaving room for doubt. Second, the case demonstrates the complexity of pilot intent issues. To conclude suicide or deliberate act, investigators must demonstrate motive, means, and opportunity and rule out all plausible mechanical or system failures. The NTSB felt they had enough to support deliberate pilot action, but the NTSC did not. The difference in thresholds and investigations across agencies is a reminder of how high the bar is in aviation accident investigation. Third, the event echoes design system history. Because of prior rudder control issues on Boeing 737s, the possibility of similar malfunction arises in every subsequent accident of that type. While the PCU servo valve is known to have failed in other crashes, in this case the official investigators did not confirm it as cause, yet civil litigation found differently, at least for legal purposes. That tension highlights the separation between engineering determinations and legal liability. Fourth, the case emphasizes the importance of continuing improvements in safety, including cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder robustness, redundant systems, better monitoring of pilot mental health, fitness, and improved design of flight control systems to guard against rogue inputs or runaway controls. Fifth, the human story cannot be forgotten. The 104 lives lost, passengers and crew, left behind families and communities who in many cases sought answers and found none wholly satisfying. The absence of definitive cause means that for some, the event remains a why that cannot be put to rest. The diverging theories among official agencies and in court adds to the anguish of the bereaved. The crash remains remembered not just as a technical investigation but as a tragic human event. In the context of airline operations, the aftermath of the crash saw SilkAir remove the flight number MI-185, as is often done after high-profile accidents. The public memory of the crash remains part of the airline's history. Being the only fatal hull loss in SilkAir's history underscores its significance for that airline and region. Wikipedia. In summary, what brought down SilkAir Flight 185 is not definitively known. The most plausible explanation according to one major agency, the NTSB, is pilot intentional action, a deliberate inputs initiating a high-speed nose-down dive. Another plausible explanation, supported in a legal context, is a mechanical control system failure, rudder PCU, causing sudden, unrecoverable dive. The investigating body in Indonesia could not choose between those and declared the cause undetermined. The aircraft plunged from cruise altitude to crash in under a minute. Recorders ceased soon before the dive, and the structural breakup occurred at extreme speed. The evidence suggests active control rather than passive failure but lacks the full smoking gun. For those studying aviation safety, SilkAir Flight 185 remains a case study in the challenge of investigating accidents where recorders cease, where cockpit intent is in question, and where conflicting jurisdictions lead to divergent conclusions. It also underscores how design legacy issues, for example, rudder control system on Boeing 737s, continue to loom in investigations long after the original crashes. If one were to distill a short takeaway, a Boeing 737-300 on a routine flight suddenly entered an extreme dive from cruise with no distress call, and because the recorders ceased before impact and the structural breakup was intense, investigators were faced with a limited evidence base. Simulations showed that the dive profile most closely matched manual inputs rather than an uncontrolled mechanical failure. Yet because motive and proof of intent are absent, the cause is officially undetermined by one major investigating body. Litigation, however, found fault in the rudder control system. So the plain fact, the airplane came down because of the steep dive, but exactly who or what commanded the dive remains unresolved. In concluding, it is worth reflecting that while aviation has grown ever safer, when accidents do occur they still challenge our ability to post-mortem exactly what went wrong, especially when the human element, the mechanical element, and the investigation process all carry margin for uncertainty. SilkAir Flight 185 is a stark example of that uncertainty.